Hi, my name is Fadlon. Here, I'll share how I animated the 3D Nintendo logo using 3 effects combined into one animation: a fractal effect, a dissolving effect, and a Sci-Fi circuit board effect. I conclude with the transformation of the 3D logo into my signature 2D logo. Okay, take a look. I downloaded the Nintendo logo SVG file. Why an SVG file? Because Blender supports vector SVG files for 3D rendering. I opened Blender 3D. In this first step, I'll transform the 2D Nintendo logo into a 3D logo and imported the Nintendo logo SVG file I downloaded earlier. You can get this animated logo project file on my Patreon, and there you can download all my animated logo project files with just one subscription and also find the full tutorial there. But if you want to support me by continuing to subscribe, it really helps me to always be enthusiastic about making 3D reveal animated logo tutorials. My Patreon link is in the description below. Okay, now let's continue. This needs to be enlarged to the size of the built-in cube. I also rotated the logo so that it aligns with the y-axis. Here, I added an extrude to the logo to give it body. To make it look more realistic, I also added a bevel. However, this sometimes resulted in an imperfect shape. This was because some vertices overlapped. So, I had to fix this by repairing the broken parts. At this stage, I wanted the logo to be broken into pieces. I duplicated the logo and converted it from curves to a mesh object. Then, I modified it with remesh to create neat and numerous polygons. This makes it easier to break the logo into pieces. I duplicated it again for the second logo, which functions as the second layer of the transformation object. Now I'm splitting the logo using the quick cell fracture effect. The source limit for the number of pieces, and the margin is the distance between pieces. This should be placed in a folder for easy targeting in the geometry nodes later. Now in the second object, I'll insert a solidify element so that the first and second layer objects don't overlap. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment so that this channel can grow and produce more tutorials. Also join my Patreon community. You can download animated logo project files and other assets. Really appreciate your support. Next, in the first logo, I added a geometry node to randomize the transform of the previously broken objects, creating a fractal effect. Here, I added collection info to target the previously broken objects in the cell folder. Set it to relative and check the separate children option. I also added an empty object to control the starting point of the fractal effect. Then, I added a noise texture node to create a random pattern and added vector math multiply to adjust the strength of the random effect. I added a position node to the original coordinates of the pieces, then combined them with the random effect using vector math add. Then I added an object info node to retrieve position data from the empty object, targeting the empty object. To calculate the distance between the logo piece and the empty object, I added vector math and changed it to subtract. To ensure the empty scale value always reads as a positive number, I duplicated the vector math node and changed it to absolute. To allow the area of effect to be enlarged or reduced, I duplicated the vector math node again and set it to divide. I duplicated it again to convert the vector direction data into a regular distance number that can be processed and then converted to length. To determine the extent of the area of effect, I added a regular math node and changed it to subtract, using any value, such as 0.8. Next, in the top path after the collection info node, I added scale instances, which will be the executors for making the pieces grow or shrink. Then I added a color ramp node to smoother animation transitions. I tried moving the empty object, and noticed that the logo pieces now randomly grow and shrink as they pass over the empty. To prevent the pieces from just staying in place, they need to be pushed forward. So I added a translate instances node after the scale instances node as an executor to push the pieces. Then I added a vector math normalize node to determine the direction of the push so it spreads outward. Then I pulled a long cable from the vector output of the subtract node in the effector assembly to the vector input of the normalize node. Here, I added vector math set to scale to control how far the pieces are pushed. Next, I added a float curve node to control the motion or bounce force to make it more organic. Then I added a map range node to lock the maximum and minimum distances for the pieces to move back and forth. Now I tried changing the scale of the empty, and voila, the pieces now automatically spread outward, not rigidly. Next, I moved the empty position to the left end of the logo because that's where the fractal effect begins to grow. Now I'm changing some node values to adjust the effect I want. In the float curve, I'm changing the graph to make the motion and reflection of the pieces dynamic. In the color ramp, I'm flipping the colors so the fractal effect doesn't flip from its initial empty position. In the subtract, I'm changing the value to slightly increase the distance between the pieces. I'm also changing the multiply value so the randomness of the pieces matches my desired distance. To make the randomness more visible, I'm changing the noise value of this texture. See, the fractal effect looks cool. Now, I'm adding keyframe animation to the empty object with transform scale. Here, I'm also changing the keyframe graph to make the timing smooth and precise. And at the end of the keyframe, I'm increasing the scale so the fractal effect is completely finished. I'm also shifting the white value of the color ramp closer to the black value so the effect expands a bit, and adjusting the return to range so that the effect is neater. Now I'm moving on to creating the second layer of the logo with the procedural dissolving effect. In Logo Object 2, I edited the material shader by adding principled BSDF and transparent BSDF nodes to make the logo transparent. Then I combined these two materials by adding a mix shader node. Now I created a random texture to break up the edges of the effect. First, I added a texture coordinate node, a mapping node, and a Voronoi texture node to create a crack pattern. Then I duplicated the coordinate and mapping textures, and duplicated the empty object to control the dissolving effect. Then, in the coordinate texture, I targeted the empty object. Now I'll combine the Voronoi effect with the empties movement by adding a mix color node and changing the blend mode from mix to linear light. Then I'll convert the combined direction data into a fixed distance using the vector math length node. After that, I added a math add node to set the radius of the area. To make the transition smoother for the system, I added a map range node and changed its type from linear to smoother step. Then I added a color ramp node and changed its interpolation mode from linear to constant to keep the lines sharp and avoid blurring. I inverted the color ramp and shifted the black color, so the effect starts from 0. In the Voronoi texture, I changed the scale value to 20 and the others to 0. And in the linear light factor, the value was 1. In the map range, the max value was 3, and I tried shifting the value of the math add node to ensure the dissolving effect worked. Now, to achieve a slightly elongated dissolving effect in the top mapping node, I changed the x-axis scale value to 0.3 and the y-axis to 0.6, and in the bottom mapping node, the y-axis scale value was 10. See the result. This is to align with the fractal effect we created earlier and the Sci-Fi effect we'll create later. Now I animate it by assigning keyframes to the math add node. I added keyframes to the dissolving effect. I forgot to change the material shader on Logo 1. It needs to use a separate material. Next, I added keyframes to the dissolving effect. Here I use a simple trick by adding another keyframe with a smaller value at the beginning and a larger one at the end, so that the effect is that nothing is left at all. Now, adjust the keyframe positions to align with the timing of the fractal animation. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment so that this channel can grow and produce more tutorials. Also, join my Patreon community. You can download animated logo project files and other assets. Really appreciate your support. The full tutorial is available on my Patreon, and you can also get the free project files there. The link is in the description. Thank you. Now, I want to create a sci-fi glowing circuit board effect. I organized the folders to streamline the process. I added a mesh plane and loaded a static 2D image of the circuit board that will be used for the animation. This needed to be resized and positioned directly in front of the logo. To make the outside of the logo completely transparent, I added a mix shader node and a transparent BSDF. I added an empty object to control the effect. Now I added a texture coordinate node and a mapping node, targeting the empty object. Now, to combine the coordinates and noise texture, I added a mix node set to linear light. And for the smooth distance, I added a vector math node set to length. Next, I used the math add node to shift the threshold position. To smooth the transition, I added a map range node set to smoother step and a value of 3. Next, I added a math node set to ping pong to create a back and forth effect in the transition area. Then, I added a color ramp node set to constant and shifted the black color until it reached a point just above white. Next, I added a texture coordinate and mapping. Then, I added a Voronoi texture set to 4D and a scale value of 20, while the other values were set to 0. Look at the result. It's pretty good, but it's not perfect. Next, I added a color ramp node set to ease and filled it with a pink-blue gradient. In principled BSDF, the emission strength value is set to 15. This setting makes the noise effect more random, not concentrated in one spot. Here, I want the effect on both the front and back sides, and I want the shape to be slightly angled at each corner to align with the logo's shape. To prevent the texture from stretching, I unwrapped the UV with cube projection and mirrored the backside to the x-axis. Check out the result. This is what I wanted with a sci-fi circuit board effect with animation running on the surface of the logo. Now, I'll animate the sci-fi circuit board effect by adding keyframes to the bottom value at the start and end of the second. At this stage, I created the center panel of the logo with a glass material that will later transform to a flat white color. I used the Shape Key feature to animate the growing panel to match the fractal, dissolving, and sci-fi animations. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment so that this channel can grow and produce more tutorials. Also join my Patreon community. You can download animated logo project files and other assets. Really appreciate your support. Now it's time to assign each logo object its own material. I use the Blender Kit add-on with the blue car paint material from the user Bad Pixel. Change the blue color to the original red of the Nintendo logo. For the center panel of the logo, I used the frosted glass material from the user Paco Salas. In this step, I'll animate the transformation from the car paint material to the logo's original flat color using a simple method, grouping the mix shaders. This grouping prevents me from creating multiple keyframes for each material. Within the group, the mix shader factor will be assigned a keyframe that will represent all materials transforming to the logo's original flat color. To achieve a perfect 3D to 2D logo transformation, I'll use a simple method. I'll parent an empty object to all 3D logo objects. Then, I'll set the y-axis scale keyframe to a starting value of 1 and an ending value of 0.01. This creates a flattened logo effect. Now, I'll animate camera using the empty object. I'll add an empty circle, rotate it 90 degrees, and then scale it until it touches the camera area. The camera is parented to the empty object to keep the camera focused on the logo. Then I animated the empty object's rotation by inserting keyframes on the z-axis at the start and end. I also animated the transform scale to achieve a linear dolly-out effect, creating a grand and cinematic feel. In the camera, I also added keyframes to the X and Y-axis locations. I also set the camera's focal length so that the logo animation wouldn't go outside the frame. Finally, I adjusted the most important part, the lighting. First, I focused on the world lighting using HDRI lighting. I also added a plain object to serve as a dark background behind the logo. Enlarge the image and move it further back. Don't forget to parent the background plane to the empty camera control plane so that when the camera control rotates, the background remains within the camera frame. In the background strength section, I added keyframes at the start and end to bring the sci-fi effect closer to the beginning. Here, I also added one additional light source as a backlight using the area light type. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment so that this channel can grow and produce more tutorials. Also join my Patreon community. You can download animated logo project files and other assets. Really appreciate your support. I forgot to fix the outer side of the sci-fi object, where the material was distracting, so I hid it in the UV editor. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to share this tutorial with your friends. They might find it useful. Thank you.